The old man stared at the broken fountain in the town square, the one that had stood silent for 3 years, and shook his head when the 12-year-old boy walked up carrying a toolbox nearly as big as himself and said those 4 words. The millionaire actually laughed out loud. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was the kind that said, "You're wasting your time, kid." But what happened next would shake this wealthy man to his core and change an entire community forever. Before we continue with this incredible story, I want to invite you to join our Sage Stories family by hitting that subscribe button. If this story touches your heart, give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories of kindness inspire us all. Now let's get back to what happened that day in the town square. Marcus Webb had made his fortune in real estate development, buying up small town properties and turning them into profitable ventures. He'd recently purchased half the buildings around the town square in Millbrook, a quiet community about 40 miles outside of Pittsburgh. The fountain in the center of that square had been the heart of the town once. Children threw pennies into it. Couples took photos beside it. On summer evenings, families would gather around it, enjoying ice cream in each other's company. But 3 years ago, the fountain stopped working. The motor burned out, and the town council discovered that replacing it would cost nearly $30,000. For a small town already struggling with budget cuts, it might as well have been $1 million. So the fountain sat there, a dry reminder of better days, filled with dead leaves and faded dreams. Marcus had noticed it, of course. It was an eyesore in the middle of his new investments. He'd even offered to have it removed entirely and replaced with a modern sculpture, something sleek and impressive. The town council was actually considering it. Most people had given up hope on ever seeing the fountain run again. But not everyone had given up. Ethan Rodriguez was 12 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that never quite stayed in place and glasses that were always sliding down his nose. His grandfather had been the town's handyman before he passed away 2 years earlier. Ethan had spent countless afternoons in his grandfather's workshop, learning how things worked, how to fix what was broken. His grandfather used to say that nothing was truly beyond repair if you understood it well enough and cared enough to try. That Saturday morning, Ethan dragged his grandfather's old red toolbox across the town square. It scraped against the cobblestones, too heavy for him to carry properly. Marcus was standing near the fountain with his architect, discussing the sculpture installation, when he noticed the boy approaching. Ethan set down the toolbox with a thud and looked up at the 2 men. His voice was steady despite his size. "I can fix this." Marcus glanced at his architect, then back at the boy and laughed. The architect smirked. "Kid, this fountain needs a new motor, new wiring, probably new plumbing. It needs $30,000 and a professional crew. What are you going to do with a toolbox?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "My grandfather taught me. I've been studying the fountain's original blueprints at the library. I know I can fix it." The architect shook his head and walked away, still chuckling. Marcus looked at the boy for a long moment. There was something in Ethan's eyes that reminded him of himself a long time ago. Before the money, before he'd learned to see everything as just numbers on a balance sheet, he heard himself saying something he didn't quite intend. "You've got until the end of summer. Then we're putting in the sculpture." It was already mid-July. 6 weeks. Marcus walked away, forgetting about the conversation almost immediately. But Ethan didn't forget. He opened that toolbox and got to work. At first he came alone, studying the fountain's mechanisms, taking notes, making sketches. He discovered that the motor wasn't completely dead, just seized up from years of neglect. The wiring had some damage but wasn't beyond repair. The plumbing needed cleaning and a few replacement parts, but nothing that required the astronomical cost the town had been quoted. His mother worried about him spending his entire summer vacation working on an impossible project, but she saw her father's determination in her son's eyes and let him try. By the second week, something interesting started happening. Old Mr. Patterson, who'd been a plumber before retirement, stopped by on his morning walk. "What you working on there, son?" Ethan explained his plan. Mr. Patterson studied the fountain's pipes, then disappeared. He came back an hour later with some spare parts from his garage and his own set of tools. "Let me show you a trick about these old fittings." A few days later, Sarah Chen, an electrician who owned the hardware store on Main Street, brought her lunch to the square. She watched Ethan and Mr. Patterson working. remembered the fountain from when she was a little girl, and asked if they needed help with the electrical components. She donated her time and expertise. Word spread quietly through Millbrook. The kid was actually trying to fix the fountain. More people stopped by. Someone donated a replacement part. Someone else brought sandwiches and lemonade. A retired engineer spent an afternoon helping Ethan understand the fountain's circulation system. Teenagers from the high school came by to help clean decades of grime from the fountain's basin. Marcus noticed the activity one afternoon as he drove past. He parked and walked over, watching from a distance. Ethan was elbow deep in the fountain's inner workings, surrounded by people who'd come together without anyone organizing them, without any promise of recognition or reward. They were there because a 12-year-old boy had decided something broken was worth fixing. For the first time in years, Marcus felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. He'd spent so much time calculating returns on investment that he'd forgotten what it looked like when people invested in something that couldn't be measured in dollars. August arrived blazing and humid. Ethan worked through the heat, his hands blistered, his clothes permanently stained with rust and grease. There were setbacks. A part would break. A connection wouldn't seal properly. He'd have to start entire sections over again. There were moments when he sat on the edge of the fountain with his head in his hands, wondering if everyone who'd laughed at him had been right. But each time he doubted, someone from the town would appear, sometimes with help, sometimes just with encouragement. "You're doing something special here, kid. Don't give up." The last week of August came too quickly. The sculpture was scheduled to be installed on September 1st. Ethan had worked miracles, but the fountain still wasn't running. He'd repaired the motor, fixed the wiring, replaced the damaged pipes, and cleaned every inch of the system. But when he tested it, nothing happened. Marcus found himself walking to the square on August 31st, the day before the sculpture installation. He told himself he was just checking on his investment, but truthfully, he wanted to see if the boy had pulled off the impossible. Ethan was there with Mr. Patterson and Sarah, going through the system one more time, trying to find what they'd missed. The frustration and exhaustion on the boy's face was evident. Marcus watched as Ethan's hands shook while checking connections, saw him blink back tears of disappointment. Something in Marcus broke open. He stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Mind if I take a look?" 3 sets of surprised eyes turned to him. Marcus hadn't used his hands to build anything in decades. He'd forgotten what it felt like to solve a problem that couldn't be fixed with money or influence. But he'd been an engineer once, right out of college, before business school, before his first development deal. He knelt beside Ethan and studied the motor assembly. He asked questions, traced wiring, and then spotted it. A tiny crack in the motor housing that was breaking the electrical connection. It was nearly invisible. The kind of thing you'd only see if you knew exactly where to look. 20 minutes later, with a repair so simple it was almost laughable, Marcus stepped back and nodded to Ethan. "Try it now." Ethan's hand trembled as he reached for the control switch. He looked at all the faces around him, at all the people who'd believed in him, who'd helped him, who'd given their time and skills to something that everyone said was impossible. He flipped the switch. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a mechanical groan that became a smooth hum, the fountain roared to life. Water burst upward in arcs of silver, catching the late afternoon sun, and the sound of it, that splash and gurgle that hadn't been heard in 3 years, filled the square like music. People came running from every direction. Applause erupted. Someone was crying. Children ran through the fountain's spray, laughing. Ethan stood there, soaking wet from the splashing water, grinning so wide his face hurt. Marcus stood off to the side, watching the celebration. The sculpture he'd planned would have been impressive, modern, expensive, but it wouldn't have brought the town together like this. It wouldn't have reminded people what they could accomplish when they worked together. It wouldn't have shown a young boy that caring enough and trying hard enough actually mattered. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Cancel the sculpture installation. Then he called his architect and told him to draw up plans for a small plaque to be installed beside the fountain. It would read, "Restored by Ethan Rodriguez and the people of Millbrook. Some things are worth fixing." The fountain still runs in Millbrook's town square today. On summer evenings, families gather around it just like they used to. Children throw pennies and make wishes. Couples take photos. And sometimes, if you're there at the right moment, you'll see a young man now in high school, sitting on the fountain's edge with his grandfather's red toolbox. helping someone else fix something they thought was broken beyond repair. Marcus Webb still owns half the buildings around that square, but he spends less time calculating profit margins and more time asking himself a different question. What can I help fix? That 12-year-old boy taught a millionaire that the most valuable things can't be bought. They have to be built together by people who care enough to try. Maybe there's something in your community that everyone says is too broken to fix. Maybe there's a person who everyone's given up on. Maybe there's a dream you've let rust and gather dust because it seems impossible. Ethan's story reminds us that impossible is just another word for hasn't been done yet. What would happen if you showed up with your toolbox, whatever that looks like for you, and said those 4 powerful words, I can fix this? Share your story of fixing something broken in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.